Have you ever walked into a place and felt like you didn't exist? Not in some philosophical, floating through the universe kind of way, but like you were standing there, flesh and bone, and still somehow invisible. Today, that was Jerome Wilson. At 47, Jerome was no ordinary guest. He was a self-made titan, the founder of one of the world's most celebrated luxury hotel empires. Yet as he stood in the marble lobby of one of his own crown jewels, no one seemed to notice. No one cared. Not the guests bustling by, not the bellboys stealing glances, and certainly not the young blonde receptionist slouched behind the front desk, more interested in her phone than the man in front of her. Jerome didn't arrive with an entourage or a flashing badge. He came alone, wearing jeans and a simple jacket. He came because complaints had piled up, whispers of discrimination, rudeness, invisible barriers, and today he wanted the truth. What he found wasn't just a customer service problem, it was rot, buried deep inside his empire, and Jerome Wilson wasn't about to walk away quietly. Before we dive deeper into this shocking story, comment below where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss how this night explodes. Jerome Wilson stood at the polished front desk of the hotel he had built, the very embodiment of luxury he had spent decades perfecting. And yet, to the young receptionist scrolling lazily on her phone, he was less than an afterthought. Kim barely glanced up when he cleared his throat. No greeting, no acknowledgement. Just an annoyed sigh, the kind reserved for someone who had the audacity to interrupt her boredom. The irony cut deep. This was the hotel where Jerome had once demanded that every guest feel like royalty. Today he could not even command a simple, "Hello." Keeping his voice steady, Jerome said, "I have a reservation." Jerome Wilson. Kim's fingers drifted across her keyboard with agonizing slowness. She didn't hide her smirk as she announced, "Mm-hmm. Yeah, nope. Don't see anything." Jerome raised an eyebrow, refusing to let irritation crack his calm exterior. "Are you sure about that?" Without even glancing back at him, Kim muttered, "Pretty sure," and returned her full attention to her phone, dismissing him entirely. It was no accident. Jerome had seen enough to recognize the difference between a system glitch and a human decision. He knew the software better than anyone. It was his software. No, this was personal. Kim had made a snap judgment. She had looked at him and decided he did not belong. Jerome suppressed a sigh and pulled up the email confirmation on his phone. "I have my booking right here," he said, holding the screen out. Kim gave it the barest glance. "Yeah, well, the system doesn't lie," she replied, her tone dripping with thinly veiled disdain. Neither does my confirmation email, Jerome thought, but he said nothing. Picking battles had become second nature to him over the years, but not today. Today was different. "Maybe you made a mistake," Kim said, voice lilting with condescension. "Happens all the time. Maybe you booked the wrong location." Jerome inhaled slowly, counting backward from 10. "Are you saying I'm lost?" She shrugged, that smug little tilt of the head. "It's an easy mistake to make." The temperature inside Jerome's chest dropped several degrees. He could feel the familiar pull toward anger, the kind of anger that didn't shout, but seethed in silent, dangerous ways. He knew better than to erupt. Power wasn't in the yelling. Power was in the restraint. "All right," he said quietly. "Check again." With a dramatic roll of her eyes, Kim tapped at the keyboard in a lazy pantomime of effort. "Nope, still nothing. Sorry." There was no apology in her voice, only boredom. Jerome knew better than to argue further. Instead, he calmly pulled out his second phone, the one tied directly to the hotel's internal system. In a few quick taps, he accessed the back-end database. And there it was, his reservation, booked, confirmed. But something else caught his eye. The reservation had been manually deleted. Deleted by Kim. Her name was right there, etched next to the action like a signature on a crime scene. Jerome looked up, studying Kim with new clarity. She wasn't just negligent. She was actively malicious. He slid the phone back into his pocket, hiding the evidence for now. "Tell me something, Kim," he said lightly. She hummed, distracted, her thumbs dancing over her phone screen again. "What happens when you delete a reservation?" Kim barely looked up. "Oh, it just removes it from the system. No big deal." "No big deal," Jerome echoed. Only front desk staff can do that, right? He asked, feigning curiosity. Yeah, she said with a shrug, as if explaining basic arithmetic to a particularly dense student. Jerome smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Good to know. He waited just long enough for her to sink back into her phone before reaching into his pocket. He pulled out the phone with the audit log displayed and placed it on the counter. Kim's gaze flickered to it and froze. Her smirk evaporated. There, clear as daylight, was the log showing her deletion of Jerome Wilson's reservation. Her name, her timestamp, her action. She swallowed hard, the color draining from her face. I didn't do anything, she stammered. Don't even try it, Jerome said, his voice low, his smile gone. The sharp authority in his tone cut through the lobby like a blade. Kim shrank behind the counter, her bravado crumbling. Jerome leaned in closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. Now, Kim, he said, savoring the moment, you're going to find me a room. Right. Now. She scrambled, hands shaking as she tapped frantically at the keyboard. Okay, room 1427, she muttered, sliding a keycard toward him without meeting his eyes. Jerome didn't touch it. He knew this hotel better than anyone. Room 1427 was next to the elevators, across from the maintenance closet, and had a glorious view of the dumpsters out back. It was, without exaggeration, the worst room in the building. And Kim thought she was still in control. Jerome tilted his head. Do I look stupid to you? She flinched visibly. Other guests had started to notice. A couple on a nearby sofa pretended not to watch. A bellhop pretended to adjust his cap for the third time in a minute. Jerome took the keycard slowly, eyes never leaving Kim's. Thanks, Kim, he said, voice silky with promise. Then he turned and walked toward the elevators. The night was just beginning, and Jerome Wilson was just getting started. The elevator doors slid shut behind Jerome, sealing him inside a brief, weightless silence. He watched the floor numbers blink slowly upward. 4, 8, 12, as the rage inside him simmered, tightly controlled. Room 1427, the worst in the building. Kim thought she had played him, humiliated him. She had no idea who she was dealing with. As soon as he stepped into the room, a cramped, noisy space with stained carpet and the unmistakable hum of the service elevator through the walls, Jerome set down his bag and pulled out his laptop. His fingers moved with precision, logging directly into the hotel's master system. No waiting for managers, no forms to fill out. Jerome Wilson was the system. In minutes, he pulled the complete activity log, every staff action, every deleted reservation, every guest complaint ignored. Kim's name was everywhere. Guest alleges racial discrimination at check-in. Staff involved, Kim. Guest claims reservation mysteriously canceled upon arrival. Staff involved, Kim. Multiple incidents, each one swept under the rug, each one dismissed without so much as a conversation. Jerome shook his head, disbelief curdling into grim understanding. This wasn't an accident. It was a pattern, a festering wound his management team had chosen to bandage rather than clean. And at the heart of it, a lazy, entitled front desk clerk who believed she could decide who deserved to be treated like a guest. Not in his hotel, not in his empire. Jerome closed the laptop and sat back, letting the anger cool into something sharper, colder, more dangerous. He wasn't here just to fire one employee. He was here to cleanse the rot at the root. He picked up the phone and dialed the internal extension for the lobby desk. It rang once before a nervous voice answered. Front desk, how may I assist you? Connect me to your manager now. Right away, sir. Jerome could hear the scrambling on the other end. Good, let them sweat. A moment later, another voice came on. Stephen Lane, the branch manager. Jerome recognized it immediately, the strained, wheedling tone of a man who had spent his career dodging real work. Good evening, this is Stephen Lane, front office manager. How can I assist you, sir? This is Jerome Wilson, he said, calm but ironclad. I'm in 1427. We need to talk. Now. Silence, just a beat too long, crackled over the line before Stephen stammered. Yes, of course, Mr. Wilson. I'll be right there. Jerome hung up without a word. 15 minutes later, there was a tentative knock at the door. Jerome opened it to find Stephen standing there, sweating under the Arctic blast of the hallway air conditioning. His smile was tight, desperate. "Mr. Wilson," Stephen gushed, "what an honor to—" "Save it," Jerome cut him off, stepping aside and gesturing him in with a tilt of his head. Stephen scuttled into the room, clutching a folder like a shield. Jerome shut the door softly, then turned. "You have a problem, Stephen." Stephen's Adam's apple bobbed violently. "If something about your stay isn't satisfactory, I assure you, I had my reservation deleted tonight." Stephen blinked rapidly. "I deleted?" Jerome nodded slowly. "Deleted, not lost, not a glitch. Deliberately removed from your system, and not just by anyone." He stepped closer, dropping his voice to a low rumble. "By Kim." Stephen paled. "Sir, I had no idea." "You should have," Jerome snapped. "Complaints have been piling up for months, ignored, dismissed, buried." Stephen's mouth opened, but no words came out. "You let it happen under your watch," Jerome continued, each word a hammer blow. "You allowed this hotel, my hotel, to become a place where discrimination isn't just tolerated, but protected." Stephen's face twisted in panic. I thought it was just isolated incidents. Nothing systemic. You thought wrong." Jerome turned to the window, staring out into the darkened city skyline. "I built this empire on a promise," he said quietly. "Every guest treated with dignity. Every customer valued. No excuses, no exceptions." He turned back, pinning Stephen with a stare so cold it could have frozen the air between them. "And you broke that promise." Stephen sagged, defeated. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Jerome stepped closer. "Not good enough," he said. "Not anymore." He handed Stephen a printed sheet of orders, clear, concise, and absolute. "You're going to walk back into that lobby. You're going to fire Kim, tonight, in front of everyone. No backroom negotiations, no whispered warnings." Stephen swallowed hard, scanning the paper with trembling hands. "And then," Jerome continued, voice like granite, "you're going to prepare this hotel for a full internal audit. Every employee evaluated, every complaint reviewed, every standard reasserted." Stephen nodded furiously, too terrified to speak. Jerome crossed his arms. "And if you fail, if you hesitate, if you stall, if you protect even one more rotten piece of this operation—" He let the threat hang, unfinished, more powerful than any shouted ultimatum. Stephen fled the room, the paper clutched like a death warrant. Jerome sat back down, feeling the weight of the moment settle across his shoulders. Tonight wasn't about one reservation. It was about saving everything he had built. And it had only just begun. The lobby was buzzing when Jerome stepped out of the elevator. Guests lingered near the velvet couches, pretending to check their phones, but their eyes flickered constantly toward the front desk where tension was thick enough to cut. A bellhop hovered awkwardly near the luggage carts, while a couple sipping champagne at the bar exchanged whispered theories. Everyone knew something was happening. Stephen Lane stood behind the reception counter, his face drained of color, gripping the edge like a drowning man clinging to driftwood. Next to him, Kim fidgeted nervously. Her bravado from earlier evaporated, leaving only pale fear. Jerome moved deliberately through the lobby, his presence turning heads as he passed. Though few recognized him by sight, they instinctively sensed it. He was the storm coming for this place. Stephen cleared his throat, his voice carrying shakily across the lobby. "Kim, could you step out from behind the desk for a moment?" Kim blinked, trying and failing to compose herself. She glanced around as if hoping someone would intervene, but no one did. The staff were frozen. The guests were spectators. This was happening, and there was nowhere for her to hide. Reluctantly, she walked around the counter to stand in front of Stephen. Jerome stopped a few feet away, arms crossed, watching. Stephen opened his mouth, faltered, and then found his voice. "Kim, your conduct tonight has been brought to my attention. Your actions regarding Mr. Wilson's reservation were unacceptable and violated not only company policy, but the standards we promise every guest." Kim shook her head quickly, her words tumbling out. "It was just a mistake." Stephen cut her off, his voice stronger now. "It wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. and it was wrong. The lobby grew impossibly still. You are hereby terminated, effective immediately. For a second, Kim just stood there, blinking, like she couldn't comprehend the words. Then her face crumpled. You can't do this, she hissed, voice rising hysterically. You don't even know what really happened. Stephen shook his head. I know enough, and the evidence speaks for itself. Kim's eyes darted wildly, searching the silent room for allies. There were none. I'll sue, she spat. This is discrimination. The irony of the claim hung heavily in the air. Stephen didn't flinch. You are no longer employed here. Security will escort you to collect your belongings. At the far end of the lobby, two security guards appeared, moving quietly but firmly toward Kim. She recoiled, tears starting to stream down her cheeks. Not from remorse, but pure, unfiltered humiliation. She turned once, desperately, catching Jerome's gaze. For the briefest moment, recognition flickered in her eyes. Not of his title, not of his wealth, but of his power. Jerome held her stare, expression unreadable. Without another word, Kim spun on her heel and stormed toward the employee hallway, the security guards flanking her. As the doors swung closed behind her, a breath seemed to release from the room all at once. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, a nervous energy rippling outward. Stephen turned to Jerome, his face a mask of anxiety. It's done, he said quietly. Jerome nodded once. That was the easy part. He strode past the front desk, every eye tracking him as he moved toward the heart of the lobby, the grand staircase, the symbol of the hotel's opulence. He stopped halfway up, turned, and let his voice ring out clearly across the space. My name is Jerome Wilson. The effect was instantaneous. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A waiter dropped a tray of champagne flutes. A young couple near the concierge desk clutched each other, mouths agape. Jerome continued, his voice steady and commanding. I built this hotel, I own this hotel, and tonight I saw exactly what it has become. Silence swallowed the lobby. For too long, he said, scanning the faces staring up at him, this place has allowed arrogance, rudeness, and discrimination to fester under the mask of five-star service. He let the words settle. But that changes now. He held up a sleek black phone, the direct line to his corporate office. As of this moment, this hotel is under full operational audit. Every complaint will be reviewed, every employee evaluated. Those who live up to our standards will thrive. Those who don't will be gone. The murmuring swelled, guests and staff alike exchanging wide-eyed looks. Jerome's gaze was unflinching. We are not here to serve wallets. We are here to serve people. And if you cannot understand the difference, you will not work here another day. Somewhere in the corner, a young clerk, the same one who had nervously helped him earlier, straightened his posture, hope flickering in his eyes. Jerome caught it and nodded slightly. There was work to do, and it started tonight. Jerome Wilson did not waste time. Back in his suite, overlooking the glittering city skyline, he spread a series of printed reports across the mahogany table. Guest complaint logs, employee incident reports, internal surveys. Everything he had quietly ordered pulled from the hotel's system after Kim's dismissal. The deeper he dug, the darker the picture became. Kim was not an isolated problem. She was a symptom. The rot ran deep. Jerome read page after page. Minorities assigned inferior rooms even when they paid for suites. Guests with accents subtly pushed toward budget options. Families receiving less attentive service if they didn't look prestigious enough. Some reports had been neatly filed away with cold bureaucratic notes. Guest concern acknowledged, resolved internally. Translated, swept under the rug. His hotel, his dream, had become a place where silent barriers, invisible to some but painfully real to others, had taken root. And the management, willfully blind. Stephen Lane, the supposed guardian of service standards, had allowed Kim and others like her to poison the guest experience unchecked. Likely because it was easier than confronting uncomfortable truths. Likely because, to people like Stephen, maintaining surface calm was more important than rooting out systemic failure. Jerome sat back in his chair, steepling his fingers. He thought of the countless guests who had come through these marble doors, expecting hospitality and finding hostility instead. Guests who had left feeling less welcome, less respected, less human. The anger that rose in his chest was different now. It was not hot and furious. It was cold, calculated, focused. He would not merely punish individuals. He would remake the entire foundation. He picked up his phone and made a call, his voice crisp. Full staff audit, mandatory recertification for every employee, no exceptions. He hung up before waiting for a reply. Then he sent the second command. Immediate compensation review for all guest complaints filed in the last 2 years. Identify and elevate guests wronged by our service. There would be no hiding, no delaying. Within an hour, the wheels were in motion. Department heads were summoned from their homes. Corporate compliance officers arrived, descending on the hotel like hawks. The young front desk clerk who had treated him respectfully earlier, Michael, according to the personnel file, was quietly pulled aside and offered a private meeting. Jerome wanted to know what the good ones had seen, what they had endured working under people like Kim. Michael, nervous but earnest, told him everything. Whispered slurs in the staff lounge, laughed off by supervisors. Subtle punishments for employees who dared to speak up. A culture where it was safer to look away than to stand up. Jerome listened without interrupting, each word etching itself into his memory. He had built this empire for dignity, for excellence, for service without prejudice, and somehow the very rot he had spent his life outrunning had crept in under his own roof. No more. The next morning, the guests woke to find a letter slid under every door, a simple, dignified message signed personally by Jerome Wilson. We failed some of you. We cannot undo the past, but we will rebuild better together. You are not invisible here. You are not less. You are the reason we exist. The letter included a direct line to an independent ombudsman empowered to hear grievances without interference. Compensation would be reviewed for those mistreated. Apologies would be issued, not by rote, but with meaning. The staff arrived to find the lobby plastered with notices. Mandatory diversity, equity, and respect training to be completed before returning to regular duties. Sessions were already scheduled to begin within 24 hours. There was no confusion, no negotiations. Change was not a request, it was a requirement. Jerome walked the halls that morning, not as a CEO issuing edicts from a tower, but as a man inspecting the walls of a house he was preparing to rebuild brick by brick. He spoke to housekeepers, to bellhops, to junior concierge. He asked them what they had seen, what they had suffered, and more often than not, their faces brightened with cautious hope. Because for the first time in a long time, someone wasn't just asking for their loyalty. Someone was finally earning it. As Jerome returned to his suite that evening, a familiar face was waiting by the door. Stephen Lane, looking haggard and small. Jerome regarded him coolly. I need to speak with you, Stephen said, voice barely above a whisper. You have nothing left to say, Jerome replied evenly. Your actions spoke loud enough. Stephen's shoulders slumped. Defeated, he turned and walked away. Jerome entered his suite, shutting the door softly behind him. Tomorrow would bring more work, more hard choices. But tonight, as he looked out over the city, he felt something settle inside him. Not satisfaction, not yet, but the first faint glimmer of something he had almost forgotten. Hope. By the end of the second day, the entire hotel buzzed with a nervous, electric energy. Mandatory training sessions consumed every conference room and ballroom, the polished spaces now stripped of their usual glitz, replaced by rows of chairs, projectors, and facilitators from an independent firm Jerome had personally selected. No more sanitized corporate videos about customer satisfaction. This time, the sessions went deep, unpacking unconscious bias, confronting systemic barriers, and forcing employees to confront realities many had never dared to face. Some bristled, some cried. Some left halfway through, unable to bear the mirror being held up to them. Jerome watched the reports roll in from the facilitators, anonymous feedback, participation levels, employee reactions. He did not expect miracles. He expected honesty, growth, or resignations. He was fine with either. At the same time, the compensation teams worked around the clock, combing through past complaints. Refunds were processed, apology letters written with sincerity, not scripted indifference. Jerome insisted that every wronged guest received more than just a form email. They received acknowledgement that they had been seen, that they mattered. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time in months, guests began to smile without hesitation when they walked through the grand revolving doors. The first hidden victory came on a rainy Thursday evening. Jerome, reviewing a stack of compliance updates in the now repurposed executive lounge, heard a soft knock. He looked up to see Michael, the young front desk clerk, standing there, nervously clutching a manila folder. Jerome waved him in. Michael stepped closer, his hands trembling slightly as he set the folder down. "I didn't know if I should bring this to you, sir," he said, voice low. "But after everything you've done, I figured you should see it." Inside the folder were printed screenshots, messages exchanged between Kim and several other former employees, group chats full of sneering jokes about guests who didn't belong, strategies for quietly reassigning rooms, even detailed complaints about managers who didn't back them up enough. Jerome read the exchanges, each word a fresh cut. Michael stood silent, waiting. "You kept this?" Jerome asked finally. Michael nodded. "I didn't know what to do with it before. I was scared. I needed the job." Jerome closed the folder and looked up at him. "You did the right thing," he said, "even if it took time." Michael's shoulders sagged with relief. "Will you stay?" Jerome asked. "We're rebuilding. I need people like you." Michael's eyes widened slightly. Then he nodded, pride blooming on his young face. "Yes, sir. I'd be honored." The second hidden victory unfolded the next morning. Jerome passed through the lobby and noticed something different, not in the marble floors or the gold-trimmed elevators, but in the people. Guests of every background were greeted warmly, with genuine smiles. A Latina mother and her young son were personally escorted to their room, the boy laughing as the bellhop joked with him about superheroes. A Muslim couple in traditional dress were offered complimentary room upgrades without hesitation or awkward glances. It was subtle, but it was profound. Jerome caught snippets of conversations as he moved through the space, guests commenting on how different the hotel felt now. Lighter, warmer, like a place that truly wanted them there, not just tolerated their money. At the coffee bar, a middle-aged black woman spotted Jerome and paused. "You're him, aren't you?" she said, smiling warmly. "The one who turned this place around?" Jerome chuckled. "Still working on it," he replied. She leaned in slightly. "Thank you. I've stayed here before. It wasn't always welcoming." Her words weren't accusatory, they were grateful. Jerome nodded. "You're welcome here now. Always." She beamed, and in that moment, Jerome felt something deeper than pride. He felt purpose. Later that afternoon, his board of directors convened via secure video call. The transformation Jerome had ignited was already sending ripples through the industry. Travel blogs were buzzing. Social media was ablaze with praise for the hotel's turnaround. Even major news outlets, once poised to skewer the brand, now ran headlines applauding the sweeping changes. Stock prices, once shaky, had stabilized and were starting to climb. The board members congratulated Jerome cautiously, still wary of the radical transparency he had forced upon them. But no one dared question the results. Jerome didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He simply reminded them, this was never just about saving a hotel. It was about saving our soul. That night, alone in his suite, Jerome poured a glass of scotch and stepped out onto the balcony. The city lights glittered below like 1,000 promises. He had fought to build this empire from nothing, fought harder to keep it clean. Now he had fought hardest of all to save it from itself. And he wasn't done yet. Hidden victories had been won. But the war for dignity, for respect, for real change? That war was just beginning. The next storm Jerome faced didn't come from guests or the public. It came from within. 3 days after the sweeping changes were implemented, a low but unmistakable murmur began spreading through the ranks of middle management. Some supervisors, assistant managers, and even veteran clerks whispered in the hallways, gathered in dark corners of the staff lounge, and traded gripes over hastily sipped coffees. He's changing everything too fast. They're just going to fire anyone who speaks up. What happened to loyalty? What about people who've been here for years? Jerome knew the signs. Resistance wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was slower, slipperier, a kind of passive sabotage disguised as concern. A form of rebellion where the enemy wasn't brave enough to oppose you openly, but dangerous enough to stall your reforms from the inside. He didn't blame them entirely. Change, real change, frightened people, especially those who had gotten comfortable thriving in a broken system. But he also knew this. If he let the rot fester, everything he was rebuilding would collapse again, even faster than before. That evening, Jerome summoned every department head to the grand ballroom. No remote logins, no delegations. If you were in management, you were expected to show up. The room filled slowly, men and women in tailored suits, stiff with suspicion. They found seats reluctantly, side conversations hissing like steam vents. Jerome didn't wait for full silence. He walked directly onto the stage, took the microphone in hand, and began. "I know what some of you are thinking," he said, voice calm, almost conversational. "You think I'm moving too fast. You think this is unfair. You think what's happening here is an attack on everything you've built." A few faces twitched, confirming he'd hit the mark. Jerome paused, letting the tension swell. "Let me be absolutely clear," he continued, his voice sharpening. "This isn't an attack. This is a rescue mission." He paced slowly across the stage, every eye tracking him now, whether they wanted to or not. For too long, mediocrity wore the mask of seniority, disrespect wore the mask of tradition, and silence wore the mask of loyalty. He stopped dead center, staring them down. "I'm not interested in protecting traditions built on discrimination. I'm not here to reward loyalty to failure." He let the words sink in. "If you are part of the problem, if you enable, excuse, or hide injustice, you will not have a place in my empire. Period." The room remained frozen. But if you are willing to adapt, to lead by example, to rebuild trust from the ground up, you have an opportunity few ever get, to be part of something better than anything we've built before. Jerome looked across the sea of faces, some defiant, some fearful, some thoughtful. "I'm not asking for perfection," he said, softer now. "I'm asking for progress." He set the microphone down, the finality of the gesture ringing louder than any applause. The meeting adjourned without ceremony. No handshakes, no pleasantries. Jerome didn't expect immediate applause. He expected action. Over the next week, the internal revolt began to crack. Some middle managers, seeing which way the wind was blowing, resigned quietly rather than submit to the new standards. Jerome accepted their resignations without regret. Better to lose the disloyal than poison the reform. Others stayed, but differently. The front desk staff began genuinely welcoming all guests, no matter what car they arrived in or what clothes they wore. Housekeeping teams started leaving handwritten notes of appreciation in every room, not just the penthouse suites. Restaurant servers treated solo diners with the same warmth they once reserved for celebrity clientele. Guests noticed. Reviews poured in, glowing, authentic, filled with words like respectful, warm, inclusive. It wasn't just the brand image being salvaged, it was the soul of the hotel itself. But the most surprising moment came one late evening when Jerome was reviewing reports in the executive lounge. A hesitant knock sounded at the glass door. He looked up to find a group of employees, housekeeping supervisors, kitchen staff, bellhops, standing awkwardly together. Michael, the young front desk clerk, who had once handed him a room key without judgment, stepped forward, a bit bolder than before. "Mr. Wilson," he said, voice steady, "we just wanted to say thank you for fighting for us." Jerome set his papers aside and stood up. He didn't give a speech. He didn't pat himself on the back. He simply said, "You're the reason this place is worth saving." And in that quiet moment, no cameras, no shareholders, no PR teams, he felt the most powerful victory of all. Not over enemies, not over rivals, but over the cynicism that told people like them that change was impossible. Because tonight, in a place where it had once been invisible, hope had found a home again. Just when it seemed like Jerome's revolution had taken root, reality threw down its last, hardest gauntlet. It came quietly like most betrayals do. A senior vice president from the corporate headquarters, Daniel Forsyth, flew in under the radar. The man wore tailored Italian suits and carried a portfolio full of polished smiles and political poison. Jerome had known him for years. Daniel was the kind of executive who loved transformation speeches, but only if they cost nothing, risked nothing, and upset no one. That morning, Jerome sat across from him in the boardroom, a thick glass wall separating them from the city skyline. "I've reviewed your reforms," Daniel said, his tone smooth as silk. "They're impressive on paper." Jerome raised an eyebrow. "On paper?" Daniel smiled, tapping a manicured finger against the table. "We're concerned about the brand's reputation for exclusivity, about the kind of clientele we risk alienating with all this emphasis on change." There it was, the quiet threat, not even disguised. Behind Daniel's corporate lingo was a simple, brutal reality. Some in the upper tiers didn't mind the old rot. They preferred it. It kept the right people comfortable. It maintained the unspoken hierarchy they were too cowardly to say aloud. Jerome leaned back, studying Daniel like he would a ticking bomb. "You're worried we'll lose the big spenders," Jerome said flatly. Daniel didn't deny it. The ultra-wealthy like tradition. They value discretion. "Discretion?" Jerome echoed. "Or discrimination?" Daniel's smile didn't falter. "Call it what you like, but alienating loyal clientele is risky. Perhaps it's time to temper the rhetoric, ease up the audits, reassure certain demographics that they're still our priority." Jerome exhaled slowly. This wasn't about business strategy. This was a final test of everything he had fought to build, and everything he was trying to redeem. He could make the easy choice, water down the reforms, apologize for making the privileged uncomfortable, keep the money flowing, the board happy, or he could stand firm and risk burning everything down. He thought of Michael's nervous smile when he handed him the folder. He thought of the mother at the coffee bar who had thanked him, not for luxury, but for dignity. He thought of every guest who had walked through the doors expecting respect and left with humiliation instead. Jerome leaned forward, voice low and lethal. "I'm not interested in running a club for people who think kindness is optional." Daniel's smile finally slipped. Jerome didn't stop. "We are rebuilding this hotel for every guest who walks through that door. If that costs us the business of bigots, so be it. If that costs us investors who prefer the old ways, so be it. If that costs me my seat at this table." He stood up, towering over Daniel. "Then I'll build a new damn table." The silence between them crackled. Daniel tapped the table once more, but this time it wasn't a gesture of casual power. It was a tick of nerves. "You understand the risks," he said quietly. "I understand them better than you ever will," Jerome replied, "because I built this from nothing, and I remember exactly what it feels like to be invisible." Daniel gathered his things without another word. He didn't offer a handshake. Jerome didn't offer one either. As the door closed behind him, Jerome turned back to the vast windows. The city sprawled out in endless lights and possibilities. He made a single call, to the board. Short, director. "If you stand with me, stand now. If you don't, step aside." The first voice to answer was shaky, uncertain. "We stand." Then another, stronger. "We stand." And another. By the time the call ended, the majority had spoken. Jerome didn't celebrate. He didn't even smile. This was the price of true change. Constant vigilance, constant courage, constant willingness to lose everything for the chance to build something better. That night in the grand ballroom, he hosted a private event, not for VIPs, not for investors, but for the staff. The ones who had survived the reckoning, the ones who had chosen to stay and fight for the future. Standing before them, Jerome spoke without notes, without script. "This place doesn't belong to me," he said. "It belongs to every guest who deserves dignity, every employee who believes in respect, every person who was ever told they didn't belong until they proved otherwise." He raised a glass, simple and unadorned. "Here's to the ones who didn't fold when it got hard." The ballroom erupted in applause, loud and real, echoing into the rafters. Jerome lowered his glass, a small, private smile playing at his lips. The final test had come, and he had passed. 6 months later, the transformation was no longer a headline. It was the foundation. Jerome Wilson's hotel had become a case study in business schools, a blueprint for companies scrambling to catch up with a new era of leadership. Journalists who once circled like vultures now wrote features with titles like How One Man Rebuilt Trust and an Empire. But Jerome didn't care about the press anymore. His focus was inside the building, inside the culture he had rebuilt from broken pieces. It started with the staff. New hires were no longer judged by how they looked or how well they mimicked old standards of luxury. They were judged by how they treated people. The interview questions changed. The onboarding changed. Every new employee sat through rigorous empathy training, not because Jerome wanted slogans, but because he demanded results. And those results were undeniable. Guest satisfaction scores skyrocketed. Repeat business among demographics previously underserved soared by over 30%. Reviews praised not just the marble floors and Egyptian cotton sheets, but the kindness, the authenticity, the humanity. People felt safe here now, felt valued, felt seen. The staff noticed it too. Morale was the highest it had been in the hotel's history. Internal promotions increased. Employee turnover dropped to record lows. Word spread fast. If you wanted to work for a hotel that treated both guests and workers with dignity, you applied here. Jerome took personal pride in attending new hire orientations, telling his story not as a CEO, but as a man who once stood at a front desk and was made to feel invisible in his own house. Titles mean nothing, he would say. What matters is how you treat the person standing in front of you, whether they're wearing a designer suit or a backpack. Meanwhile, the guests who once took their entitlement for granted found themselves faced with a new reality. Respect was mutual. Entitlement would not be coddled. Bigotry would not be ignored. The standards had risen, and only those who rose with them would feel at home here. Of course, not everyone stayed. Some longtime guests, used to having their biases indulged, quietly shifted their business elsewhere. Jerome did not mourn their departure. The hotel's profits more than recovered, built now on loyalty rather than legacy snobbery. One day, while walking the lobby, Jerome paused near the front desk. A young black couple stood there checking in, their toddler wobbling excitedly between them. Michael, now the lead concierge, bent down with a wide smile to offer the little boy a lollipop, treating them with the same gracious attention once reserved only for celebrities. Jerome watched as the couple's shoulders relaxed, as their smiles widened. That unspoken moment, "We are welcome here," was worth more than any advertising campaign. It was the fulfillment of everything he had fought for. Later that evening, Jerome met with his board of directors in a conference room overlooking the city skyline. The agenda was simple: a full review of the past year's reforms. Profits were up. Guest satisfaction was at historic highs. Employee engagement was at levels few luxury brands ever reached. And beyond the metrics, something deeper had shifted. The hotel had become a symbol of possibility, a place where change wasn't just a promise, but a reality. Still, some board members, cautious by nature, asked him if he worried about the long-term risks. "What if this commitment to ethics costs us major accounts down the road?" one director asked. Jerome leaned forward, his gaze steady. "If standing for dignity costs us business, then that's business we were better off without." There were no further objections. In the weeks that followed, Jerome expanded the new model to his entire hospitality empire. Every hotel bearing his name underwent the same transformation: rigorous audits, staff overhauls, guest feedback reforms. It was grueling. It was messy. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. It was also the best, because change didn't stop at one hotel. It was a legacy now. Jerome began receiving letters, real letters, handwritten on hotel stationery and mailed to his office. Some were from guests, thanking him for building a place where their children could feel welcome. Some were from employees, thanking him for creating a workplace where they could be proud to wear the name on their badge. One letter stood out above the rest. It was from an elderly man who had stayed at the hotel with his granddaughter. "Thank you," it read, in shaky cursive, "for making a place where she could see what dignity looks like. Now she knows it's possible, And so do I. Jerome framed that letter and hung it behind his desk. Not the awards, not the press clippings. A single letter from a man who understood. That was the legacy Jerome Wilson would leave behind. Not an empire of marble and gold, but a world where the invisible were seen again. And this time, they weren't going anywhere. Months turned into a year, and Jerome Wilson's once shaken empire stood stronger than ever. Not because he had doubled down on luxury, but because he had redefined it. In every hotel bearing his name, the transformation wasn't just visible, it was alive. Concierge now introduced themselves with pride, knowing their role wasn't simply service, but stewardship of respect. Housekeepers left notes of welcome and gratitude in every room, no longer invisible workers, but essential guardians of the experience. Managers walked the floors with open eyes and open hearts, no longer rulers of a hierarchy, but leaders of a family. And the guests responded. Families who had once hesitated to book. Professionals who had grown used to being side-eyed at check-in counters. Dreamers, travelers, people of every background and story. They flooded back, not just for the plush beds or gourmet dining, but for the feeling, you are welcome here. In an industry where reputations shifted with the tides of social media outrage, Jerome's brand became a rock, reliable, respected, revered. But Jerome knew better than anyone that legacy isn't measured in quarterly reports. It's measured in the moments no one sees. The bellhop who stops to kneel and tie a child's loose sneaker without being asked. The front desk clerk who patiently walks a nervous elderly guest through check-in. The housekeeper who leaves an extra towel because she notices the guest has a baby carrier. Those were the moments Jerome lived for now. The quiet victories, the invisible kindnesses that stitched a broken world back together, thread by thread. And yet Jerome also understood that success could breed complacency. He refused to let it. Each quarter, he personally reviewed random guest feedback. He continued unannounced visits, sometimes disguised as a traveler in a simple hoodie and jeans, standing quietly in lobbies to see if the warmth they promised on the brochures lived in the reality. Most times it did. Sometimes it didn't. And when it didn't, Jerome didn't yell, didn't fire people on the spot. Instead, he pulled them aside, told them a story, his story, how once, not so long ago, he had stood at a front desk, wallet in hand, reservation confirmed, and been told, without words but with devastating clarity, that he didn't belong. That story changed more minds than any memo ever could. One afternoon, standing in the sun-drenched courtyard of his flagship hotel, Jerome met a young woman, a newly promoted manager named Aisha. She had started as housekeeping staff. Now she ran one of the most competitive properties in the portfolio. She smiled brightly when she saw him and said without pretense, "You made a place where people like me could rise?" Jerome smiled back, pride and humility warring inside him. "I didn't make it," he said. "We made it, together." Because that, more than anything else, was the moral legacy he wanted to leave. The power of one spark, one act of standing firm, one refusal to let injustice slide by for the sake of comfort. One man invisible in his own house who chose not to scream, not to riot, not to retreat, but to rebuild the house brick by brick until no one could ever be made invisible again. Not here, not under his name. In the end, Jerome knew that true justice isn't loud. It's patient, it's persistent. It's the slow, relentless turning of a world towards something better, one small act at a time. And maybe no plaque would ever be hung in his honor. Maybe no award would ever capture the quiet dignity he fought for. But every time a mother walked through those hotel doors without clutching her child's hand tighter from fear, every time a traveler smiled and relaxed because they knew they would be treated like a person, not a problem, every time a young worker looked up at their manager and believed, truly believed, that they could build a future there, that would be his reward. That would be his immortality. As the sun dipped behind the skyline, Jerome took a long, slow breath. He didn't need applause, and he didn't need recognition. He had something better. He had changed the game. And in doing so, he had changed lives. One hotel, one heart, one act of courage at a time. He looked up at the gilded letters over the lobby entrance, his name shining bold and bright, and allowed himself the smallest of smiles. Not because it bore his name, but because now, finally, it bore his soul, and that would never fade. "Welcome," he whispered, the word carrying into the soft, humming evening. "Welcome home.